I'm going to show you some wrist extension, eccentric neural grooving from the quadruped and collapsed quadruped position. Starting in quadruped with the fingertips toward the knees, I'm going to bring one knee forward and step one leg back. What I'm going to do is lift my fingers off the ground into deep wrist extension. I'm going to lean forward and then I'm going to slowly come back. So I'm going to lean forward. All of my fingertips will come off the ground. I'm going to hold here, and then I'm going to slowly transition back to that collapsed quadruped position. Try that one more time. Wrist extension. Let the fingertips go off the ground, and then try to keep the fingertips off the ground as you begin to lean back, causing that eccentric neural grooving of wrist extension. So only a couple reps there. You can do both wrists at the same time if you do it that way. And then I like to come into a wrist flexion position. From here, I'll put about 30% effort of the back of my hands into the ground, and I'll begin to flex one finger at a time toward the midline of my palm. And I'm trying to keep all the other fingers down when I do this and just trying to control one finger at a time. And you'll see it's a little bit harder than you think. And you just perform that in wrist flexion. Remember not to push too hard into the ground and go at your own safest and greatest intensity. I think about 30% is good for wrist flexion. I tend not to go too much further than that. And then I like to go with all 10 fingers into the palm, trying to make a fist while I'm in wrist flexion. And this is basically like performing a passive range hold in wrist flexion and really kind of squeezing to my max intensity here, so about 30 to 60%. From here, I like to do some ulnar deviation and radial deviation. Ulnar deviation is when the pinky goes toward the wrist, and radial deviation is when the thumb goes toward the wrist. And I'm using my thigh as a block, and I'm also performing full wrist controlled articular rotations or wrist circles, going in my full end range and circle my wrist here while I'm pressing the forearm into my knee. And this is going to create a lot of tension and feedback, which is going to allow me to control that controlled articular rotation of the wrist. So again, ulnar and radial deviation, pressing the forearm into the thigh in a modified combat position. Again, this is going to help control that deviation of the wrist. And then after the deviation, I'm going to go into my controlled articular rotations. Again, utilizing all the muscles to perform these movements. As you see, I'm creating tension in the biceps, the triceps. I'm pushing into the ground. Naturally, my legs are creating more radiation. And I can also squeeze my abs and shoulders as I perform this exercise to create more control and neurological feedback in that wrist car or controlled articular rotation. So those are some examples. Here's another way to perform that same wrist extension, passive range hold, but instead of bringing one leg back, you can also do it with both knees bent in the collapsed quadruped position. So just leaning forward and trying to extend those wrists and seeing if you can do it without leaning forward as well. As you see here, I'm kind of holding this position, breathing, and just getting comfortable in the position, and then I'm taking some time to inhale, irradiate, and then try to lift those fingers into the ground. And what I'm going to do first is push the fingers into the ground before trying to pull those fingers off the ground. So actively pushing the fingertips into the ground and then trying to go deeper into wrist extension. Again, you can do the wrist flexion, all 10 fingers at the same time. And you're kind of holding this position passively first, and then squeezing the fingertips toward the palms. Again, focusing on your breathing at first, and kind of getting relaxed before you kind of make any effort to contract, and just seeing how that feels in this position first before tensing and performing the passive range hold, where you're squeezing the hands or the fists together here, and you're going to feel a lot of neurological tension in the top of that wrist. This may take a couple times to get used to. I know at first when I started doing this, my wrist felt really weak, but the more I started doing this, the stronger my wrist got. Again, you can perform some radial and ulnar deviation. I also like to do this in the quadruped position with my fists nice and squeezed, leaning back and forth, and really putting some pressure in the deviation, both in the ulnar and radial deviation. I like to do this kinetically, as you see, in a dynamic fashion. Helps me gain a little bit of drive.